He thought one click in a team meeting was enough to destroy me. Too bad for him. I only needed one click too. Some people think a title equals power. Then they forget. They're the ones who created the very moment that would bring their entire career crashing down in just 3 minutes. There are those who believe public humiliation is a management tool. What they don't realize is that every recorded conversation, every casual confession, every moment they thought was private, it's all just evidence waiting for the right moment to surface. And when that moment comes, when you've been pushed too far and cornered too completely, sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply letting them hear their own voice. My name is Caroline Foster. And for 8 years, I've been the one person keeping Summit Tech Solutions' flagship software project from complete collapse. At 35, I'd worked my way up from junior developer to project team lead through sheer competence and an unfortunate willingness to clean up other people's messes. Our Denver office buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that comes with corporate restructuring. Layoffs whispered about in break rooms. Managers suddenly very interested in who was essential and who wasn't. That's where Ethan Caldwell came in. 42 years old, perfectly pressed shirts, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. As project director, he was my immediate supervisor and the kind of man who confused authority with intelligence. Ethan had a particular talent for taking credit for successes while ensuring failures had someone else's name attached. Usually mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the only reason our team functioned at all. While Ethan spent his days in executive meetings talking about synergy and optimization, I was the one actually managing timelines, solving critical bugs, and keeping our increasingly frustrated clients from jumping ship. Our team knew it. Hell, even upper management knew it, though they seemed content to let Ethan play the role of the competent director while I did the actual work. But competence, I'd learned, could be a liability in corporate America, especially when your boss sees you as a threat rather than an asset. Ethan had been testing boundaries for months. Small slights during meetings, casual dismissals of my ideas only to present them as his own later. The kind of microaggressions that are hard to prove but impossible to ignore. The company's restructuring had made him bolder. Suddenly, every team meeting felt like a performance where Ethan demonstrated his dominance, usually at my expense. He'd interrupt me mid-sentence, dismiss my suggestions with condescending chuckles, and make jokes about how I needed to learn to speak up, right after talking over me. The worst part was watching my team members' faces during these moments. The uncomfortable glances, the way they'd look anywhere but at me, the collective tension that followed each of his little power plays. I'd started to feel like a frog in slowly boiling water. Each incident was small enough to seem manageable, but the cumulative effect was suffocating. I knew Ethan was building a case against me, positioning himself as the indispensable leader while painting me as the weak link. The restructuring gave him the perfect cover. He could eliminate me under the guise of streamlining operations and install one of his cronies in my place. What Ethan didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment longer than he'd been planning my downfall. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and I'd learned mine years ago. In corporate warfare, documentation isn't just helpful, it's survival. The moment came on a Tuesday morning during what should have been a routine team meeting. 23 people on the Zoom call, developers, analysts, project coordinators, all expecting the usual status updates and deadline discussions. I had my coffee ready, my weekly report prepared, completely unprepared for what Ethan had planned. Before we dive into project updates, Ethan began, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound authoritative. I need to address some organizational changes that will help our team move forward more effectively. The phrasing should have been my first warning. Ethan never used corporate speak unless he was about to do something he knew was wrong. Effective immediately, Caroline will be transitioning from project team lead to a project support role. This restructuring will allow her to focus on her core strengths while giving us the opportunity to implement more dynamic leadership strategies. The words hit like a physical blow. I felt my face flush, heard the sharp intake of breath from several team members. Sarah Martinez, one of our senior developers, actually said, "What?" out loud before quickly muting herself. But Ethan wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, that smug smile spreading across his face like he was savoring every second. I know this might seem sudden, but sometimes we need to make tough decisions to help people grow. Caroline's had some challenges with leadership consistency, and I think this change will give her the chance to develop those skills without the pressure of team management. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated. He could have sent an email. He could have spoken to me privately first. Instead, he chose to announce my demotion in front of everyone, framing it as some kind of developmental opportunity. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could practically taste it. I'm sure Caroline will approach this transition with the professionalism we've all come to expect from her, he continued, looking directly at me through the camera. After all, learning humility is an important part of career growth. Learning humility. The phrase echoed in my head as I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. 23 people watching, waiting to see how I'd react. Some looked embarrassed for me, others seemed shocked. But a few, Ethan's inner circle, were barely hiding their satisfaction. Thank you for the feedback, Ethan, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the team in whatever capacity serves the project best. It was the response he wanted, gracious, professional, defeated. I watched him nod approvingly, probably thinking he'd just solved his Caroline problem with one brilliant stroke. The meeting continued with awkward transitions to actual project business, but I barely heard the rest. My mind was racing, not with hurt or anger, but with cold, calculating precision. Ethan had just made his biggest mistake, and he had no idea. He thought public humiliation would break me. Instead, he'd just given me exactly what I needed, justification for what came next. What Ethan didn't know was that I'd been recording our private conversations for months. Colorado is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of without his knowledge. I'd started doing it after the third time he'd completely misrepresented what we'd discussed in a meeting, leaving me to look incompetent when his version of events made it to upper management. The recordings had become my insurance policy. Every condescending comment, every inappropriate joke, every moment when his professional mask slipped, I had it all stored in a secure folder on my personal drive. Hours of audio that painted a clear picture of who Ethan Caldwell really was behind closed doors. The best material came from our weekly one-on-ones. Ethan felt comfortable during these sessions, chatting freely about his strategies and opinions. In one particularly damning conversation from 3 weeks ago, he'd explicitly told me that if our current project failed, he'd make sure I was the one who took the fall. "You're the perfect scapegoat, Caroline," he'd said with that laugh of his. Smart enough to be blamed for technical failures, but not connected enough for anyone to really fight for you. Then there was the recording from last month when he'd instructed me to misrepresent our project timeline to the board. "Tell them we're on track," he'd said. "I don't care if it's not true. I need this quarter to look good for my performance review." When I'd expressed concern about misleading the executives, he'd brushed me off. "That's what you're there for, to make me look good and take the heat when things go wrong." But the most damaging content was his casual sexism. Ethan had a habit of making comments about female employees that ranged from inappropriate to downright hostile. He'd complained about emotional women in leadership, made crude jokes about which female clients he'd charm into keeping their contracts, and once spent 10 minutes explaining why men were naturally better at technical leadership. Over the past week, I'd carefully edited the most incriminating segments into a seamless 3-minute compilation. Nothing was taken out of context or manipulated, just the clearest, most damning examples of Ethan's true character, arranged for maximum impact. The audio quality was crystal clear, his voice unmistakably recognizable. I'd also reached out quietly to Janet Morrison in HR. Janet had been with the company for 15 years and had a reputation for being both fair and thorough. More importantly, she'd been asking subtle questions about Ethan's management style recently, suggesting she already had concerns. I hadn't sent her the recording yet. That would come later, when the timing was perfect. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Ethan had to be the one to create the moment. He had to push me far enough, publicly enough, that my response would seem not just justified, but necessary. I needed him to give me a platform, an audience, and a reason that no one could question. I just had to wait for him to hand me the perfect opportunity. And knowing Ethan's ego, I wouldn't have to wait long. The opportunity came exactly 1 week later. Ethan had scheduled an all-hands meeting for the entire project development division, not just our team, but every project manager, developer, and analyst in the department. The meeting invite was titled Leadership and Accountability, Moving Forward Together, which should have been my second warning about his intentions. The night before, he'd sent an email to the entire division with me, CC'd ostensibly about learning opportunities, but really just another public humiliation. As we continue to grow as a team, he'd written, it's important that we all embrace feedback and use setbacks as chances to develop. Caroline's recent transition is a perfect example of how we can turn challenges into growth opportunities. I'd read that email 3 times, each reading making my jaw clench tighter. He wasn't content with demoting me. He wanted to turn me into a cautionary tale. A public example of what happened when you failed to meet his standards. The meeting started at 2 p.m. sharp. 47 people on the call this time, including several senior managers and even a VP who rarely attended operational meetings. Ethan had clearly promoted this as something important, something worth their time. He'd spent the first 15 minutes talking about excellence in leadership and the importance of accountability at every level. Then he got to the real reason for the meeting. I want to talk about a recent situation that I think illustrates some important principles about professional growth and self-awareness. He began, his camera centered perfectly, his smile practiced and condescending. Last week, we made some organizational changes that might have seemed difficult, but were necessary for our team's success. He was looking directly at me through the camera, his eyes bright with satisfaction. This was his victory lap, his moment to cement his narrative about my failures in front of the entire division. Caroline, I hope you'll share some thoughts about how you're approaching this transition. I think everyone could benefit from hearing about the learning process. The trap was perfect, refuse to speak, and I'd look bitter and unprofessional, agree to participate, and I'd be forced to publicly validate his version of events. Either way, he won. Except he'd just given me exactly what I needed. A captive audience, a professional context, and complete justification for what came next. Actually, Ethan, I think the team would benefit from hearing about leadership accountability from your perspective, I said, my voice calm and measured. I have something I'd like to share that I think really illustrates your points about transparency and professional standards. I watched his smile falter slightly. He sensed something but couldn't quite place what. Of course, Caroline. I'm always happy to discuss leadership principles. Perfect, I said, clicking to share my screen. I've prepared a brief audio compilation that I think perfectly captures your leadership philosophy. I recorded these during our private meetings over the past few months, completely legal in Colorado, as I'm sure you know. The color drained from his face. I could see him frantically trying to remember what he'd said, what I might have captured. But there was too much material. Too many moments when he'd let his guard down. Caroline, I don't think, he started. But I was already clicking play. His own voice filled the call, crystal clear and unmistakably his. You're the perfect scapegoat. Caroline, smart enough to be blamed for technical failures, but not connected enough for anyone to really fight for you. The silence that followed was deafening. 47 people listening to their director casually discussing how he planned to sacrifice a subordinate. But I was just getting started. The 3-minute compilation played without interruption. Ethan's voice continued, each segment more damaging than the last. Tell them we're on track. I don't care if it's not true. I need this quarter to look good for my performance review. Then came his crude assessment of our female VP. Janet thinks she's tough, but she's just another emotional woman who'll fold the moment you push back hard enough. The worst was yet to come. His voice, casual and confident, discussing why he'd never promote women to senior technical roles. They're too emotional for real leadership. Caroline's a perfect example, competent enough to do the grunt work. But she'll never have what it takes to make the hard decisions. I watched the participant list as people started turning off their cameras. The VP's camera went dark first, then the senior managers, one by one. They were disappearing from view. But I knew they were still listening, still recording this in their minds. Ethan's face had gone from pale to red to a sickly gray. He kept trying to interrupt, to speak over his own recorded voice, but the audio quality was too clear, too damning. There was no denying what everyone was hearing. The final segment was the most recent. If this project fails, Caroline takes the fall. That's what she's there for, to make me look good and absorb the blame when things go wrong. When the audio stopped, the silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could see Ethan's mouth moving, but no sound was coming out. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I think the team deserves to hear this directly from you. As you always say, accountability starts at the top." That snapped him back to reality. This is completely inappropriate," he stammered. "These were private conversations taken out of context." "Actually, they weren't taken out of context at all," I interrupted. "This is exactly the context they occurred in. These are your words, your strategies, your leadership philosophy. The team should know who they're really working for." He was frantically clicking, trying to end the meeting. But I'd timed this perfectly. The damage was done. 47 people had heard exactly who Ethan Caldwell was when he thought no one was listening. "This meeting is over," he managed to say, his voice shaking. "Caroline, we'll be discussing this immediately after." But people were already leaving the call. The participant count dropped rapidly: 47, 43, 38, 31. Within 30 seconds, it was just me, Ethan, and a handful of people who seemed too stunned to move. I looked directly into my camera, my expression calm and professional. "I'll be sending the complete recordings to HR within the hour, along with a formal complaint. I believe in accountability, too, Ethan. I just have a different definition of it than you do." Then I left the call. My phone started ringing within minutes. The first call was from Janet Morrison in HR, then from the division VP, then from colleagues who'd been on the call. I let them all go to voicemail. I had work to do. I spent the next hour preparing a comprehensive report, the full audio files, transcripts of the most damaging segments, documentation of every incident of retaliation and harassment, and a detailed timeline of Ethan's escalating behavior. Everything meticulously organized, legally obtained, and impossible to refute. By 4 p.m., I had official confirmation that Ethan Caldwell had been suspended pending a full investigation. By 5 p.m., the story had spread throughout the entire Denver office. By the next morning, it would be a case study in corporate justice. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 24 hours, HR had interviewed 6 team members who corroborated everything in my recordings. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been documenting Ethan's behavior. Several colleagues had been keeping email chains and notes about his inappropriate comments and retaliatory actions. Janet Morrison called me personally that evening. "Caroline, I want you to know that the company takes these allegations extremely seriously. Your documentation is thorough and professional, and frankly, it confirms suspicions we've had for some time." She paused, then added, "What you did took courage. I know it wasn't easy to come forward, especially given the professional risks." I almost laughed. Professional risks. If only she knew how calculated every step had been. The next morning brought an official email from the executive team. Ethan Caldwell had been terminated for serious violations of company policy and professional conduct standards. The message was brief, corporate, and final. No severance package, no graceful exit, just gone. By noon, I had another email, this one from the VP who'd witnessed the entire meeting. "Caroline, given recent organizational changes, we'd like to discuss your role moving forward. Are you available for a conversation this afternoon?" The conversation lasted an hour. They offered me Ethan's position, project director, with a team of 47 people and a salary increase that made my eyes water. They also offered a formal apology for the unfortunate situation, and assurances that this kind of behavior would never be tolerated again. I accepted, of course, but not before negotiating additional protections for my team and implementing new policies around workplace harassment reporting. The following Monday, I held my first all-hands meeting as project director. The same 47 people who'd witnessed Ethan's downfall were now looking at me with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and what I can only describe as healthy caution. I want to be clear about something, I began, looking directly into the camera. This team succeeds when everyone feels safe to do their best work. That's not negotiable. Sarah Martinez unmuted herself first. Caroline, I just want to say, we're glad you're leading this team. The chorus of agreement that followed was genuine, warm, and completely different from the tense silence that had characterized our meetings under Ethan's reign. After the meeting ended, I sat in my office, Ethan's old office, looking out at the Denver skyline. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge, it's about being prepared when someone else's actions create the perfect moment for truth. Ethan had thought one click could destroy my career. He was right about the power of a single click. He just had no idea whose finger would be on the mouse. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace justice. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what you think about Caroline's approach to handling workplace harassment. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and let me know what other workplace situations you'd like to hear about.